Interaction Biology here at the University of Glasgow, and I will be one of the chairs for this evening. Thank you for joining us today. We're happy to have so many of you in person and online. We have three wonderful speakers that will shortly be introducing to you. But before we begin, I'll say a few words of introduction to those of you who might be new to Biolit Talks or who might be new to this series. So Biolit Talks is a collaboration between students and the life sciences and humanities here at the University of Glasgow. We host events in which we bring scientists, literary academics, and artists together to speak about a common theme. And in these events, we exchange interdisciplinary knowledge. So last year, we ran an event series in which we focused on infectious diseases from the perspectives of biology and literature. Earlier this year, we ran a standalone event in which we talked about the role of language in science and literature. And then came back in November with a new event series focused on the gut. Last week, we ran our first event, looking at the gut microbiome and the role that it has in understanding ourselves. And tonight, instead, we're focusing on the gut-brain axis, which is this bidirectional connection between the gut and the brain. And it's a really fascinating topic. We've had a long understanding of it and the role that the gut plays in cognition and function. And I'm very much looking forward to exploring it tonight. And I'd now like to pass it over to my colleague for tonight, Michael Water, who is a doctoral student in creative writing here at the University of Strathclyde.
Hi everyone, just a few little practicalities before we get into the fun bit. We're running this as a hybrid event, as Sophia said, so if everyone can please in the room make sure your phone's off or on silent, as we are recording it. We're going to show it later, and if everyone on Zoom, make sure you're muted, that would be super appreciated. The way we're going to work this evening is we're going to begin with a discussion between the five of us, which will run for about 45 minutes, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. So please be thinking about those while we're chatting. Hopefully it's very generative. And then afterwards, of course, there will be refreshments outside. When you've left though, before you leave though, please remember to fill out the survey forms. That's super helpful for us for all of our funding and so forth. And online should have a digital survey you can complete too. So yes, please do that for us. Now, let's introduce our wonderful speakers and get into the fun bit. So next to me, I have Professor Bhismadev Chakrabarti, Professor of Neuroscience and Mental Health and Research Director of the Centre for Autism at the University of Reading. Next in line, we have Professor Matthew Smith, Professor of Health History at the University of Strathclyde Centre for the Social History of Healthcare, and co-founder, co-editor of Polgrave's Mental Health in Historical Perspective series. And finally, besides Sophia here, we have Aby Watson, a neurodivergent dance artist, performer, and researcher, currently completing a PhD at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
I wonder if we could start just by you guys telling us a little bit about your interest in the topic and how it connects with your research. Just a brief introduction. Aby, do you want to kick us off? Is that all right?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everybody. So my name is Aby. My pronouns are she, they. And yeah, I am doing a PhD at the Conservatoire, which is called Disordering Dance. I'm also a dance artist and a practice researcher. So my PhD is very much working with my own positionality as a neurodivergent, dyslexic, dyspraxic, ADHD, and also potentially autistic, but who knows? Dance artist, and there's kind of two central aims to my PhD work. I'm forming and voicing a critique of the neuronormativity that exists within dance culture and practice. And I'm also, through practice, making a radical neurodivergent centered aesthetics and methods of making dance. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thanks, Aby.
Great, thanks. Thanks everyone for coming. So yeah, I'm Matt. I'm a historian. I'm originally from Canada. I came over here in 2006 to do my PhD on the history of the Feingold diet, which was an alternative approach to attention deficit hyperactivity in children, which focused on eliminating food additives from the diets of children. It was very controversial. Kind of came and went during the 1970s and 80s, and then has made a very interesting recovery in the last 10 or 12 years. Nothing to do with my research. So I'm also interested in history of food allergy, and I guess just in terms of an overarching historical statement, is that the relationship between what we'd say the gut and the brain, today we might in the past talk about the mind and the diet, goes back thousands of years, covers multiple cultures all over the world. So it shouldn't be too surprising that we're re-embracing these sort of ideas today. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Matt. Bishma?
I am Bhishma. I'm an autism researcher. That's the shortest description I can give of myself. But kind of if we need to unpack that, a lot of my early research and including some of my current research is on what's called embodied cognition. So how we respond to other people's emotions and social signals, and how our body plays quite an important role in that. And almost all of this work was concentrated above the neck till 2018. And then around 2018, I started wondering that there is quite a lot of that's also happening below the neck. And that's where I got more and more interested in the gut, particularly the gut microbiota. And my current research involves looking at the impact of gut microbiota and their metabolites on brain and behavior. So that's where I'm coming from.
Great, thank you. And I mean, thinking about this, I think it's really interesting. One thing we've all talked about before this is kind of how the term gut feeling has such a subjective term to all of us. I wonder if anyone would like to tell us a little bit about what it means to them and how it's kind of changing in light of some of this research. Bhishma, do you want to go?
I can start. I mean, I'll take, given that we are representing multiple disciplines here, and I'll wear my neuroscientist hat. So I'm kind of speaking from that perspective here. Now, the colloquial use of the term gut feeling is not to be taken literally, because just like if I say, well, we say, oh, you have my heart in when you're in love. That does not necessarily mean that love is in the heart. Similarly, when I say gut feeling, it does not necessarily mean there is a feeling in the gut. What it encompasses is a series of what we call interoceptive processes or interoception. So the body has a whole bunch of signals. There is signals from the heart, cardiac signals. There is gastric signals, how tight your stomach feels right now. There is signals from the autonomic nervous system, how sweaty my palms are right now. And my awareness of all of these physiological signals is kind of translates to something what we call gut feelings. Again, that's kind of that would be the physiological or neuroscientific angle to that.
Just to speak a lot to your work, Aby.
Yeah, I mean, when I was thinking about answering this question, the first thing I was going to make really explicit is that I'm actually quite new to thinking about the gut in relation to all this work. But what I'm not new to thinking about is interoception. And as a dance artist, I have a very embodied relationship to interoception. And also as a neurodivergent person, I'm very interested in interoception in relation to that. So a lot of research has shown that people who have lived experiences that might fit under like emotional disorders, or like, for example, with ADHD, an aspect of that being like emotional dysregulation, that a lot of the people that have those lived experiences, research shows that they have a less interoceptive sense, or have less of an ability to recognize, observe, be aware of the internal state of the body, both in a physiological sense, like, do I need the toilet, for example, things like that, but also an emotional sense. How does this make me feel? And I'm interested in why that is so. And research has shown, and also voices, neurodivergent voices within the academic sector, and now putting forward this idea of this, particularly the work of like Nick Walker, who's a really great neuroqueer researcher, an academic, about how actually through being neurodivergent in a neuronormative world, in a world that assumes and demands you have a neuronormative performance, that you show up, think, feel, behave in a way that is socially understood as like normal, actually the pressure of that creates this experience called masking. And I don't know if you've heard of that before. It's also a word that can be used in like an LGBTQIA+ context, and also in other contexts to discuss when you can perform certain behaviors to pass as the dominant norm. So for example, if I was here and I was, didn't feel comfortable to be my neurodivergent self, and I suppressed my need to move my leg or look up whilst I'm thinking, if I pretended that those weren't my natural ways of being, that might be masking, for example. So these neurodivergent scholars are putting forward this idea of, is this severed interoceptive sense, is that, just in the brain? Is that like, oh, that's who they are? No, it's actually a cause of being neurodivergent in a neuronormative world. This severed connection to the internal landscape is a cause of the world asking and demanding of you to perform something that you are not, if that makes sense. It's like performing how you should be, not as you are. So through that performance, over time, that then affects embodiment, that then affects your interoceptive awareness and the relationship between your conscious understanding and what's subconsciously happening in the body. So yeah, in relation to gut feelings, going back on that makes me think about how that might be difficult to know what those gut feelings are, what those wants and needs, and even processes of the body and the mind and emotions, to be able to recognize those things clearly. That having a sticky, difficult relationship with a gut feeling, feels in the neurodivergent experience.
It's interesting because a lot of, from what you're saying, it's clear that some of this severing is happening from that existence within a neurotypical society. It's reflected in from the social shape. So I wonder, if we talk about the history of it, at what time does this start to shift? Is there some sort of historical break between this idea that we are our gut feeling and that it's acceptable to feel connected to that, whereas now we feel like we should be a certain way and that we are rational and led by the mind? Is that something we can see changing in history, or is it always kind of this way in the West?
I think different cultures have always set different standards for behavior, and I suppose people who are neurodivergent are lucky today because they are living at a time where we're actually much more sensitive to these things. If you look back, even going back further into the 20th century, but certainly in the 19th century, the expectations of what you could be as a human in different societies, certainly here in Glasgow, would have been much more restricted. And I think, that's something we have to be mindful of, is maybe there's a lot of horrible things going on around us. But there are some good things, and my research looking at ADHD and over the last nearly 20 years has certainly, I've always been kind of a neurodiversive advocate, but it certainly pushed me more in that direction. I think the other thing I would say, just in relation to the idea of a gut feeling, is that often we as lay people, not non-medical experts, we have a sense of something. We have a sense that this food doesn't agree with me. I don't know why, but it just doesn't agree with me. Maybe the allergist doesn't think it does, but I think it does. And I think one of the things that comes out in my research, partly because I do a lot of oral history, is talking to people who become their own experts on these sorts of things, their own experts on their diet, and that's something that goes back centuries. Think of Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, talks lots about food. Diet is all throughout that book. That's from 1621. But I think it's quite important for us as academics to really not just look at what's published in peer-reviewed journals, but also talk to people about their own experiences. There's Jim Phillips, who's over in the history department here, and David Smith once wrote or edited a volume on nutrition and the history of nutrition, and they have this statement that always sticks with me. And it's basically everyone is an expert on their own diet. And I think we're starting to say the same thing, I think, in regards, or as regards neurodiversity. We're gathering more expertise in terms of how we see ourselves fitting in, but also how we see ourselves not fitting in, and where we decide to make allowances and where we decide, no, I'm going to be this way, and that's it. So I think that aspect's quite important. Knowledge about these topics is, there's some top-down high academia, but there's also a lot of bottom-up knowledge that we need to be mindful of as well.
If I can follow up to that, that raises a very interesting kind of contrast between Aby's and your positions in some way, because everyone is an expert on their own diet, and that's great. But if what Aby referred to, as well as the whole body of research that's showing that everybody might not be the best experts of their own gut feelings. That some people might be better tuned if gut feelings are interpreted through the lens of interoception. Some people might be better off in telling when they need to go to the loo. Some people might be worse off. And so diet is one thing, but gut feelings, to assume that everybody has the same level of expertise on their own gut feelings, I wouldn't think that would be warranted.
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there needs to be a balance between expertise of what people, and a lot of people end up exploring these aspects of their lives because they're not particularly happy with how things are, and they're seeking out expertise. The problem is that sometimes the expertise doesn't always give them the answers, and they have to look elsewhere.
I think one thing that obviously came up is that we tend to live and view things in a very neurotypical way. And oftentimes, some of the things that you described about having different feelings based on the situation to what a neurotypical person might have, is that there is a change there is sort of this thing that we describe the behavior of neurodivergent people more as symptoms than as just different understandings. And I'm wondering how this can inform the practices in your different disciplines.
Yeah. Can I have some thoughts on that? Because one thing I really want to kind of bring to the table is this idea of how we even see neurodiversity within society. And as you were saying, this categorization of neurodivergent being as like as a symptom of a deficit or a dysfunction or some kind of pathological deficit. And that I want to bring into the room this idea of the pathology paradigm of neurodiversity. So there are different ways, different lenses for how we can understand neurodiversity within the social context. And the dominant one within our society, and that has been since pathology came to being as a field, is I lost my train of thought. Pathology paradigm. Yes, this is the dominant narrative, which understands neurodiversity from this perspective of deficit. And this way of seeing neurodiversity is very similar to the medical model of disability. And I don't know if that's something that folks here are familiar with, but this idea that the medical model of disability locates the notion of disability within the individual, and it sees the problem of disability to be within the individual. So for example, say there's a wheelchair using person who can't enter a building because there's steps, the medical model of disability would say, I'm sorry, that's a shame that you're in a wheelchair, that you can't access this building. It's putting the focus of the problem on the person and their impairment. Whereas the social model of disability it understands impairment as separate to disabled lived experience, and that disability is of social causation. It's when you meet barriers within the social context that disable the person. So for example, again, this idea of this person, this wheelchair using person trying to enter a building that doesn't have a ramp. Well, a social model would say that's horrible that this building does not have the means to let you enter. So it would see the disability as a cause of the societal context. So the pathology paradigm is very much kind of in bed with, for want of another terminology, with the medical model of disability. This idea that the neurodivergent person is inherently a deficit, is inherently dysfunctional, is inherently, there's something wrong with them. There's something wrong with them. And pathology seeks to fix that person, curing them, taking them through therapies to change their natural way of being, to make them fit into the neuronormative world. But the neurodiversity paradigm is a separate way of seeing neurodiversity that rejects that dominant narrative of being the pathological narrative, and instead sees neurodiversity as natural and valuable as any other form of human diversity within our world. So it sees it as natural and valuable. It also recognizes that the idea that there is a normal brain, which all other brains are compared to say whether you're normal or not, you're right, you're wrong, you have a problem or you don't have a problem, that's a social construct. In the same way that the idea of saying that there's a correct race or ethnicity or sexuality or gender, that's, those are social constructs, saying that there's a correct one of those. Anyway, I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, sorry. Neurodiversity paradigm, yes. And the third principle of the neurodiversity paradigm being that neurodivergent people and neurodiversity does not exist within a bubble. It interacts with society, and social inequities exist for neurodivergent people in the same way of other people who are in margins of experience. So going back to the point that I've forgotten we were at, but we were talking about pathology, symptoms, yes. As a neurodivergent person, as a neurodivergent researcher, a paradigm shift is essential for the well-being of neurodivergent people. And I think everybody, actually, shifting from this idea of the pathology paradigm to the neurodiversity paradigm and accepting neurological difference and different ways of being, behaving, living, I think is very important. Kind of forgotten what the start of that was.
I mean, it's super interesting, and I think there's something really interesting as well about about the subject today, about the gut-brain axis. There's something potentially disruptive in that because of the pathologizing tendency wants to isolate an organ, find a problem and cure it, right? And its most basic level. I'm oversimplifying for it. But is there a way that understanding the complex interrelationship of the gut and the brain can problematize that simplification and lead us into this sort of a paradigm shift? And is that something you think would be interesting from both of your perspectives? Maybe starting with you, Bhismadev.
Right. I mean, just to connect to what Aby mentioned earlier. First of all, and your question, I do not believe the gut-brain axis poses a particularly unique challenge to the pathology or the categorical distinction paradigm. There are a huge number of problems with the categorical paradigm, and then I actually have an honest question for all of us on the panel as well to consider later, is whether neurodiversity and neurodivergence can coexist in some way. Because in some way, by saying that X is neurodivergent, automatically there is another category being created. And then the opposite of neurodivergent is non-neurodivergent. So are we just perpetuating the category that we sought to break down? And so I'm much more from the scientific angle, very much from the research angle. The only thing that seems kind of most reasonable to do is to think of neurodiversity, and the gut-brain axis is no different to any other kind of dimensions of difference. Like just like we have different heights, we have different hair color, eye color, and all of that. So the gut-brain axis and the amount of metabolites the certain microbiota will produce will be different between you, me, and everybody else. And just comment on the medical model, because it will tie back to this. is that building on from that, the lack of utility of the diagnostic label or the category is also there with the example that you gave. So if we have a person who cannot enter a building because the person is in a wheelchair, now the intervention is not necessarily dependent on the etiology of the person. So the person might not be able to walk because they have cancer in their legs, maybe they had an accident, maybe they never grew a leg in the beginning. So there might be all kinds of etiological reasons why this person is in a wheelchair right now. But intervention should be about how can we help this person enter the building.
About the barrier.
It's about the barrier, it's about function. It's the approach should be about helping an individual function with minimum number of obstacles in the world that we live in, rather than say, well, this is your diagnostic category, when that diagnostic category knowledge doesn't really add anything to the intervention. You would need a wheelchair irrespective of what are the reasons for which you might not be able to walk. So I think that's something crucial to understand, is that the diagnostic category is not adding anything to that. Coming back to gut brain, I mean, yes, of course, there are individuals who would have certain extremes of microbiota. I mean, there's certain different populations of microbial species in their gut, but do we need to put them in specific categories? I don't think so.
One of the things I was sort of going at with that is that the potential disruptive impacts on that, I suppose maybe Matt could shed some light on if there's anything in it. It's just like that it challenges the conventional notions of what it means to rely on your brain or rely on your gut. If we talk about how complex the interrelationship actually is, it problematizes the simplicity of that diagnosis. Is that something that it could be challenged as a historical narrative?
I'm sorry, just to add on to that question for Mike, because it's something I think would be nice to explore as well. But you sort of mentioned this idea that the connection between the gut and the brain is by no means a new thing. So if you could touch on some of the historical examples that we found on that as well, I'll answer my next question, just because I thought it fit in well.
Thank you. So I think one way of talking about this is to think of the medical paradigm that dominated for 2,500 years, which is humoral medicine. So this is the idea that our body had 4 humors, blood, black bile, phlegm, and yellow bile, that circulated through the body and had to be in balance. Now, they had to be in balance. So if you had too much black bile, you became melancholic, depressed, lethargic, just like Robert Burton when he was writing of melancholy so as to avoid melancholy. Similarly, if you had too much yellow bile, you might be angry, manic, aggressive. But along with that, there was also the notion that there were humoral personalities. So that's why we have the word melancholic, sanguine, choleric, and phlegmatic. I like to think I'm phlegmatic, cool as cucumber. But I think it's really important, and one of the best ways to think about this is think about Winnie the Pooh. So Winnie the Pooh, Eeyore, Tigger, and Rabbit. And I won't mention them, which I think they are, but you can probably figure out which ones they are. I'd love to know if A.A. Milne had that in mind. Anyways, so I think that's a useful way of thinking about it, because I mean, I'm a bear of fairly little brain. And so what I like to think of, a continuum versus categories. And I'm very much more along the line of the continuum side of things. But we also have to think that at certain points, sometimes things become too much. So in terms of height, whether you're on the short side or the high side, sometimes it becomes too much for the body to take. And there are other side effects that happen and shorten life and all the rest of it. So within those categories, so I think we need to accept that people are different in those different ways, as people with the humoral medical paradigm would have, but also recognize that at some point there needs to be some sort of intervention. Now, key thing there is that probably the most important bit of intervention is the societal intervention.
Absolutely.
The other things we can do as well. But the societal intervention is really important to ensure that these people can cope. And I think in previous, centuries, there was probably more understanding. I mean, I should say that before I was an academic, I was a careers advisor. So I'd be okay, Aby, let's think about where your skills and abilities lie, where your interests are, and what career would fit that best for you. So I think there's an element of that kind of thinking, and where people with certain characteristics shouldn't necessarily want to be force that square peg into a round hole, but on the other hand, we should also try to make society accepting enough that different types of people, we don't just have to have a square peg, we can have a square hole, we can have other types of holes as well. So in terms of thinking about the gut brain, I think within humoral medicine, that was that was just taken as read. There was a connection there, and it was possibly the most important because it was the one that individuals had most control over. You needed a physician to bleed you or to give you emetics and purges and all sorts of horrible medical treatment, but your diet was in your own hands to a certain extent. Of course, if you're poor, you didn't really have any of those choices, and that's another thing that I think we need to remember. But that link between the gut and the brain, they wouldn't have explained it in those terms. And I think we can talk about terminology as well. I think the fact that we call it the gut brain and that sort of the accepted term is interesting in and of itself. But this goes back a long ways, and I'm just talking about kind of the European medical tradition, India, China, other parts of the world have their own ideas of how these are connected. And I think really it's only been in certain decades of the 20th century where these ideas kind of fell away. They were always there in some places, but it's good that we're taking them much more seriously. What happened in 2018 anyways? Historians are interested in dates, so
this would be oral history. So I ended up having lunch with a microbiologist.
yeah.
And telling them about our work in autism and the various neurotransmitters that are involved and interesting to us. And this microbiologist told me, "Oh, did you know that the microbiota in the gut also produce quite a lot of these neurotransmitters?" And I had no clue. And so I said, "So what happens to that? All that neurotransmitter that's produced, like dopamine, serotonin, GABA." The standard things that neurons use to talk amongst them. And he said, "Well, I don't know." And then we looked up the literature over the next few months and years, and actually no one really seems to know what happens. So that's what we are trying to find out now. So
Great, all over lunch.
I think one of the things you've all touched on is this idea that your body can sort of influence your thoughts and your personality. I'm wondering if we talk about it in the opposite direction instead.
Yeah.
So that would be
The mind influencing the body.
Well, one way that this emerges, I gave a lecture on psychoanalysis today for my Majesty in Society students, so this is fresh for me. So during the middle of the 20th century, if you had eczema or asthma or even hay fever, and you went to your GP, particularly in the United States and Canada, you would have thought you might get a referral for an allergist. Not necessarily. You would have been equally likely to get a referral to a psychiatrist because of the idea that the psychosomatic idea that aspects of your mind, things that have happened to you, stress, early childhood experiences, all act out on the body, and the gut being just one of those manifestations. Skin, the brain, migraines, those sorts of things, other sorts of neurological responses, asthma. There was a term called parentectomy, which Yeah, it sounds scary. It's not quite as scary as it sounds, but basically the idea was that if your child was suffering from asthma and the psychiatrist thought that, you know, this is the smothering parent's fault, get them to a private school away from the home. And there are plenty of, you know, case studies in the literature where, you know, this is done and apparently the asthma goes away. So that definitely flows in both directions, and actually within the allergy literature, this mode of thinking becomes so powerful during the mid-20th century that other explanations, particularly those involving environmental chemicals, get lambasted because it's supposed to be the other way around. And there's a very interesting book by a fellow named Richard McCarness, who's a psychiatrist who becomes interested in this and writes this very interesting book on the relationship between diet and mental disorder, and it's called Not All in the Mind. And so the argument there is getting right back at the psychosomatic argument. It's not all in your mind. It is what you're eating. So it's a really fascinating debate, and that's just a few decades in the 20th century.
And I mean, in terms of the traffic in the other direction, so brain to gut, I mean, there has been quite a few experiments done in rodent models. I mean, there is reasonably strong evidence to suggest that chronic stress can alter the population of gut microbiota. Now, what we do not know very well is exactly how this influence, in the other direction, is the mechanism of this influence, because the primary nerve that carries the information from the gut to the brain is called the vagus nerve, and the vagus has an interesting balance of incoming versus outgoing information. So the incoming information, by which I mean the information going from gut to the brain, is taken by what's called afferent fibers, and the vagus is 80% afferent and only 20% efferent, which means only 20% is coming down from the brain to the gut. So it's kind of asymmetric in how much information is going in versus how much information is coming back out. Now, there might be other ways through which the brain is the brain is influencing the gut microbiota, and that's a very active area of research. So, but yes, there is definitely bidirectional traffic.
I think that's so interesting. It's almost as if we're more predisposed to getting information from the gut, which perhaps makes, correct me if I'm wrong, more sense from an evolutionary perspective, given that we were a gut long before we were a brain. Yeah.
That is true. That is very true.
And in your dance and in your practice, where perhaps do you see differences in emotions or cognitions reflecting differences in physicality?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that this really makes me think of is stimming. And I don't know if that's something that people are aware of, but stimming is self-stimulatory or self-regulating behaviors, and that can come through across the senses from, kinesthetic movement and proprioceptive, or it could be to do with tactility, it could be due to, seeing, feeling, touching, smelling, tasting, all across the senses. And I am very interested in approaching stimming from a dance perspective, because stimming is, well, if we think about it in relation to movement and kind of more of a kind of proprioceptive kinesthetic stimming, if we kind of focus on that for a minute, it's actions of the body coming from an internal impulse that through that kind of self-actioning generate a shift in consciousness. And there's research that's speaking to and with neurodivergent people who say that stimming creates a feedback loop within their brains that allows them to kind of metronome their inner rhythms to be in relation to the environment. So stimming through physical action is a kind of making sense of the world. Yes, I've forgotten the root of the question. Could you ask me again?
How the mind can influence you.
Yes, of course. So through stimming, the physical body can then create these altered consciousness experiences. So the self-soothing, the self-regulating, that through this movement, it changes the inner consciousness experience. And I'm interested in taking that methodology of stimming, taking that approach, and particularly putting it within a professional dance context. So within dance, because it's such a visual kinesthetic art form, the tradition is kind of to present a kind of objectification of bodies, where we see bodies from the outside and we see dancing bodies and choreography as means to communicate content to an audience. And that's very much about kind of an external projection of movement, coming from an external place. And within my own practice and my research, as someone that's doing autoethnography, I found that quite stressful, because to be able to embody a choreography, to kind of perform it outwards as an object to kind of meet the needs of the choreographer, that is expecting me to remember what I'm doing. And the core crux of my thesis is like, if I struggle to remember and embody predetermined choreographic sequences as someone with dyspraxia, how then can I exist as a dance artist and present my physicality in a way that is not disabling, in a way that doesn't make me hate myself, essentially, which is really sad. So a way that I found to kind of counteract that is to lean in to stimming, lean into this physical impulse of the body that's there, that wants to generate movement, and that also creates this, as I said, self-regulating feedback loop. So instead of performing in a way that's quite stressful, what's coming next? Which of my hands is supposed to be going across the space in this time, blah, 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 an organization of the body for external perception. Instead, I'm interested in moving from a more somatic place, from a place of sensing, of moving from within, and presenting that to audiences. And the choreography is then the way in which I hold that stim state, that stimming way of being within the choreographic. So, yeah. And it also, hopefully, and my research is finding that through taking that stimming methodology, it also creates dance that has a stimming function. It's an act of self-care. Through attending to what my body and my mind are needing in that moment in a fluid structure, yeah, I'm able to respond to what my body needs, not what I think my body should be doing, to then, yeah, creating a dance practice that's rooted in self-care and compassion. And yeah.
Super interesting. And I think I'd be interested to hear what both of you think about how this more holistic understanding of how we connect these different interoceptive, is that right? Interoceptive processes. Yeah. My brain just went blank. Interoceptive processes, and how this holistic understanding of them can generally improve our well-being and in life, and from the perspective of your discipline. So.
Well, I'll speak to that related to one of my other interests, which is on sport and mental health. And what struck me about what you're saying, Aby, is that just like dance, sport can be something where it's wonderful for one's mental health, or it can be absolute shit for one's mental health. And it's not just about the winning and losing. It's about, you know, how you feel as a person, as an athlete, your body image, whether you can express yourself as a sexual person within your sport, all the rest of it. So I just thought that's an interesting connection. And when we were developing a project that was not funded on this, what we were really trying to come to grips with was, okay, what the hell do we do about this? So how do we make sport better? And for me, a lot of it boiled down to, you know, toning down the competition side of things and thinking about sport as more as a vehicle for telling stories and for creating amazing stories. like, that's why you watch Match of the Day, right? Because, it's part of both, and also the amazing things that humans can do with their bodies and their minds. So I think, and again, we're often coming back to this idea of, we need to change society in ways to allow these sort of things to happen. And I think, thinking about it in terms of sport is an interesting parallel. So I just wanted to articulate that, because I think it is a challenge, because people have deep-rooted ideas of what dance should be, what music should be, and also what sport should be. On the other hand, you also have people who watch anything, some kids kicking a deflated ball in a corner, and they'll watch that to see who wins, So there's lots of interesting things going on there. And I think one of the challenges is to tease out what's really important, and what are we really getting out of this? What's good about this? What's bad about this? And to be mindful of that. So when I watch the World Cup, as I will do, even though where it is and how it's awarded, I'll try to think of these things. Go Canada! We're in it 4 decades.
To get back to your question as well, on this holistic, what does it mean for kind of holistic understanding of? I mean, that's something that I guess is kind of a growing up for the field of neuroscience, because back when I entered the field, in retrospect, we had a very blinkered view of neuroscience, with neuro being very strong as a word, and so we necessarily focused on the brain. And as time goes, we realize that this is very much just one part of the puzzle, and one needs to look at the entire system that's functioning, and it's the muscles, the gut, the microbiota, and all of it, really. So, in some way, biology is moving from individual disciplines to a massive data science discipline. Effectively, the big challenges for science is how do we integrate these various signals, because these signals operate at different spatial scales, different temporal scales. Some signals, like if you're recording with electrodes from the stomach region, so the common thing for kind of quantifying how tight your stomach feels is called electrogastrography, and it will pick up different rhythms. And so that's a rhythm of a certain frequency. And if that frequency goes up a little bit, you'd feel nauseous. And if that frequency goes down a little bit, you're going to feel more relaxed. Then there are other similar rhythms in the brain that's going on. And how are these rhythms coupled? What are the mechanisms for coupling? So the big questions in terms of the holistic understanding are questions for data analysis, because as a kind of a complete dispassionate neuroscientist looking at the human body, the human is a source of multiple data points, and we have no clue, or very little clue, on how these data series actually map onto each other. So without that, what we have is the 7 blind men looking at the elephant, right? I think this is the process. So yeah.
Can I again go back to your question? Because there was, when we were talking, I was like, oh, I want to say this in relation to this. Oh, but I'll let you finish. And the things I wanted to say was, in this, we've been speaking about this kind of like body-mind disconnect, right? And this kind of hangover of like Cartesian dualism, right? And how that affects Western thought, and how that affects how we think about our minds and our bodies. And are they the same thing? Yes, they are. And I wanted to put forward this idea from neurodiversity studies and the neurodiversity paradigm, that actually we are body minds. We are not this, messy matter that's governed by an intelligent mind. We are one and the same. Like, the neuro in neurodiversity means nerve, not brain. And nerves go from the top of your head to the tips of your toes, honey. Like, it's the whole package. So yeah, I wanted to put that idea forward, this thing from neurodiversity about us being body minds and how the mind is an embodied phenomenon and it's not something that we can distinguish as separate categorizations. So I wanted to put that forward. And I also, going back to dance, and I feel like we're also speaking a lot about human nature. We're speaking a lot about, human nature, and we're speaking a little bit about evolution. And I read this great paper recently by Christiansen et al. About the functions of human dance. So dance is something that we can see across all locations, across all places and all times. Dance is something that human beings do that is not necessarily about an aesthetic presentation of art. It's a behavior. It's a natural human behavior. And this great paper finds that they locate neurobiobehavioral functionings of dance and why we do it. And I wanted to bring them to the conversation. So through dance, we are able to focus our attention into one kind of stream of being. It also is regulatory, and this is also, I'm interested in the stimming and dancing being the same thing, but dancing restores the kind of biochemical, to a certain extent, or can restore biochemical things going on in the brain. It also elicits emotional responses, and it also enables a process of self-actualization. So through dance, we can greater understand our interoceptive sense, what's going on the inside of our bodies, but also the exteroceptive sense, what's happening in the environment around us, and also our proprioceptive sense, what's happening in the movement of the body. So it's enabling us to self-realize and understand ourselves to a greater level. And also, and this is one I'm super excited about and passionate about, is dance as a mode of social cohesion, as it's something that's evolved to help us work out problems, particularly ones that do with violence or arousal, to work out those problems. And on a kind of neurochemical basis, dancing together releases certain endorphins that create a sense of social togetherness, a sense of being together that is inherently pleasurable. And I'm really excited and interested in this idea of dance as a natural human behavior. And I think it's how we should be approaching dance now, with such disconnect between people, such polarity within people. I feel like realizing that dance isn't just something that's for elite bodies, I went and trained in ballet, therefore I'm a dancer. Like, we're all dancers, like it's in our bodies. And I'm sure everybody here, or at least I can imagine there's a lot of people here that feel that when they're on a dance floor with people. And as humans, we seek it out. That's why dance, we go clubbing, whatever. But I think there's potential in recognizing dance as a human process, as an aspect of human nature. And I would be really excited to see a way of approaching dance to work out some of these really sticky tensions that we have within our disconnect between brain and body and our happiness, but also our disconnects from each other, and kind of coming together through dance experiences. So I just wanted to bring in a bit of that.
I think it's really interesting. We're going to have to wrap up in a minute and turn to questions, so if everyone could just have a think about questions. But one thing that makes me think of, that maybe I'd love to hear any final kinds of opinions on, is the way you talk about it, obviously, is dance as a language. And one of the things we're struggling with here is this kind of interdisciplinary language for this interconnectedness within us. Data has also been mentioned, as well as dance, and these feel like opposite ends of a huge spectrum. But what other languages and ways of using language might be useful in helping us harness this broader understanding of the interconnectedness?
I'm biased, of course, but I think it is interesting to look at the words that have been used historically to describe these sort of things, and why those words have been used, and why sometimes those words have been discarded. Because we're always in the present, and we always think that, okay, our understanding now is the most sophisticated and the best that there's ever been, and we don't often enough look back and think about, well, humans were smart back then too. They just had different tools and paradigms through which they understood the world. So that's all I would say on that.
So I think unhelpful ways of kind of thinking about human diversity need to be rejected. I would make a kind of position statement on that. And they need to be rejected not just for ethical reasons and social reasons and inclusion reasons. They need to be rejected on grounds of science. Whether we are talking about gut-brain axis or whether we're talking about just gut microbiota or brain variability, we need to accept the human diversity that exists in multiple dimensions. We need to come up with scientists need to come up with better tools to capture this diversity. And the common language we have is numbers. So once we accept that we are just variations on a scale, then we can measure the numbers of the scale. We can say, this is the amount of this particular species of microbial species that you have, this is what I have. Now, of course, whether that will map on to subjective experience, no, we would never, science will never claim that, forget about emotions. Science will even not claim that your experience of blue is the same as my experience of blue. So if we say that experience is retained, subjective experience is retained within the individual, but we still can measure things that might be relevant in terms of, for example, we can find out the number of cone cells in your retina and measure the cone cells in another person's retina. It wouldn't tell me how you experience the blue, but it will tell me if you have a color processing deficit. You have in or if you're super perceptive of colors, the whole the gamut of variation there.
Yeah, I'm going to jump right on that train and say that I guess maybe it's not so much of a language in terms of like a kind of technique of talking. It's more about an approach. And I agree, I think to recognize that all diversity is natural, hands down, that is the way that human beings are, have been, always will be. So neurodiversity is all diversity is natural and valuable, but we also then, when we think about, well, how do we go forward then, there's accepting and acknowledging that, but it's also then about the structures in which understand, process, and then treat diversity across the board, and don't treat it as natural, but center a particular type of experience who has dominated the narrative up until now across the board. So for me, it's about compassion and it's about acceptance. And I feel like, I know they're like really big, kind of airy-fairy, nice things to say, but I think on a very practical level, it's what we need right now, because then we need to recognize that everyone and everything is connected through nature. And that's the way that we need to go forward, I think, for the betterment of everybody across the board. Yes.
I really like what you had to say, Bishma, that sort of codifying and quantifying can even the playing field. But of course, what we've talked about is so nuanced that one of the challenges is how do we speak about it, how do we codify it.
Importance of dialogue. We'll always come back to it at Violet Talks.
Should we move on
Speaking
to
of
our
dialogue,
questions?
yeah, we should move on to questions from everyone else in the room. So got a mic ready. Does anyone have a question for us? Instantly blocked someone at the front. We're good to go.
Hello. So you talked about like the arbitrary nature of categories, and I was just thinking how this relates to like categories like science and art and history and everything, how everything is just the universe or whatever it is that we're all living in, and that these are just different lenses to view the world through. And like if the goal of just what humans are trying to do is just to understand, like whatever the meaning of that word actually is, I was wondering if like at what point does it just become arbitrary for science to keep isolating things if it's not then bringing those isolated, because I understand like the value of isolation for like within the scientific method, but if you're not then bringing that to the larger picture within disciplines and being able to take from art and history, you know, like really merge everything together. At what point is it just, what are we even trying to do?
Sure. I guess this is the question for me. So I'm in the job of defending science here. So having argued against categories in the specific context of psychopathology, I would now kind of respond defending the use of the use of categories and in specific context. In some way, human language is the best example of categories. How do I know this is a chair? I mean, you might say, well, you know, if it is one kind of a modern furniture thing, sometimes you can't even tell if it's a chair or a table, or, you know, you can always have outliers in that way. But we need a common language just to function in the world. It is true that your chairness and my chairness will not be 100% superimposable, but we still need a common language. So that's where science comes in. So we need, I mean, I'm not saying that retain the silos, retain the disciplinary divides, but I do think we need common language.
Does anyone else want to speak to that, or can we move to the next question?
Yeah, I'm just vibing with that.
Yeah, thanks. All right. Any other questions? So we've got two here. I think on the back place.
Thanks for your thoughts. It was very interesting to listen to the discussion. I was wondering about your thoughts on the following. You know how we talk about the fact that we sometimes perceive if something's wrong or if something's actually not right with our diet. But I think that so many people think that they're a lot healthier than they actually are. And there's actually many studies that show that people typically overestimate the extent to which they're healthy. There's a lot of illness also, though, that manifests asymptomatically for many decades before it reflects in overt illness. And I actually have a good friend who goes to medical school in Florida. She's an athlete, and she's actually diabetic because she just eats too many sweets. She's not overweight just because she trains all the time, yet she's actually diabetic now. So we were talking about diet the other day, and she said, I've never thought that I was actually less healthy than I thought I was. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how do we trust our bodies and how do we trust our biases, or how do we dissociate from them? Because I think I would believe that all of us here in the room would probably be a little healthier than we actually are.
Everyone's kind of spoken to this a bit. Who wants to kick us off with the question of how we reunite with our bodies and understand better?
I just have a very kind of quick, immediate response that I want to say is like, what is health? Like, in the same way that I don't believe there's like kind of objective understanding of like what is a normal brain, I'm like, what is the healthy body, you know? And that is, yeah, I don't even know what my answer to that question is, but that's what your thought made me immediately think, like, because there's maybe kind of societal understandings of what health is, like, you know, like as you said, like your friend is an athlete, they're like really, you know, I can imagine that means they have an athletic physique and that they're, you know, people are seeing them as like safe and slim and like all of these kind of signifiers that might suggest like healthy body. But what does that mean on a kind of body mind relation? And can we even categorize what health even is in an objective sense? Because I guess from a pathological sense, obviously this is not my field, so you can tell me if this is wrong, but I guess, is it like the absence of disease or something would be categorized as health? But like,
sometimes it's also excesses, right? Because say as an athlete, you probably do consume some products in excess.
yeah.
That may be healthy to some degree just because you spend so much time working out, but then where do you draw that line of what's healthy and what's not?
Exactly.
And the definition of health, even if you want to go down that road, changes over time and in different contexts, and it will continue to change. And I think that that's important to realize. And of course, the elephant in the room is that for all of us, that health will come to an end at some point. And I think, you know, concepts like quality adjusted life years can, especially if they're informed more by individuals rather than what health insurance company decide. That, you know, those can be useful ways of, I guess, taking ownership over how you, whether you think yourself is as healthy or not. You know, I could go through decades with elevated cholesterol and be told by my doctor time and time again, you've got to do A, B, and C. But until that heart attack or the stroke, you know, maybe I don't care. But I think, you know, the point that these things change over time is important, and in different contexts. You know, my sister was a very high level athlete as well, and you know, her even now, 20 years after she retired, you know, her interpretation of what health is very different from my interpretation, and is certainly would be different from many other people. I think the problem is that we also have a lot of people and institutions within society that are trying to tell us what healthy is. And sometimes when and probably the best example of that is, you know, within the kind of the fat studies area within academia, kind of challenging the idea of obesity and overweight. And I think that's a really interesting area for debate, because you know, there are good arguments, not just in terms of the individual, but how as society we provide healthcare and we support people to live healthy lives, while also recognizing that body shape is something that, in terms of health, is socially constructed as well.
So if I can add to that, I think there's a confusion that comes from mixing the subjective and the objective. So if you think about quality of life is essentially a subjective phenomenon. I am the best judge of my quality of life, but I'm not the best judge of my physiological status. So whether my cholesterol is high or low, whether whether my gut microbiota are in perfect harmony with everything else, I can't tell. That would need to be measured. So I think as long as we can decouple the kind of physiological states from quality of life, and say, well, you know, my indicators show my cholesterol is high, so I need to take certain steps. But my quality of life is very good. So that has no link to the cholesterol, but I would want to be aware of the cholesterol so that I don't just pop off one day. So I think that's why we need to be, you know, we need to be mindful about the subjective and the objective, and give equal importance. I mean, when it comes to the objective aspects, we definitely are not the best judges of ourselves because of optimism bias and all of that.
We have one more question behind you, and I can see hands everywhere. I'm trying to block you all. I will come back to everyone who noticed.
Hi, thanks very much, by the way. I've taken loads of notes. It's been super interesting. So thank you, all of you. Yeah, I just have I hope a simple question, but I know that you mentioned that sports can be good or shit for mental health.
Apologize. It's been a long day. I'm slipping into a Western Canadian vernacular.
But also that there's a sort of sexual identity tied to sports, and I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about that, because I found that point interesting. I wrote it down, but I didn't quite know what it meant.
Sure. Well, what I mean specifically is that if you are a gay man and you're a professional footballer, there's about a 1 in a million chance you'll come out during your professional career. If you're a woman and you're a lesbian playing football, there's a very, very high chance you'll be encouraged to come out in your, not even your professional career, but probably way before that. Now, the stress, and you can read autobiographies by guys like John Amici, for example, who's an English basketball player who came out after he retired. For example, there's lots of, well, there's not lots, there's a few, I should say. In terms of an environment, so we interviewed LGBT athletes as part of a project in terms of their mental health, and what struck us was that for some, coming out within the confines of a club was absolutely perfect, not a dance club,
No,
but like a sporting club. And in fact, they didn't want to go into the, the kind of more different atmosphere of a club, but for them, whether it be swimming or wrestling or whatever, it was really that, and I should say, these were LGBT clubs, they weren't, hetero clubs. This was the perfect environment for them to kind of hang on to both aspects, if as society determines it, both aspects of their life, as a man, this idea of kind of fit and hyper masculine and wrestling or whatever, but also as a man who loved men. And but on the other hand, if you're in the environment of sport and you know that you are homosexual and you cannot, these are supposed to be your teammates, you're supposed to be able to talk to them. And I mean, just again, I see Prince William is talking again about sport and mental health, and that's great. Thanks, Wills. But the problem is that we're not really getting to the nitty gritty aspects. And what I liked about our LGBT and mental health sport project is that it really got at some of the basic stuff that we forget, like winning and losing, like, body image. And, we've had all sorts of scandals recently, gymnastics, swimming, cycling, track, all these, mainly focusing on women, but some focusing on men as well. All these different aspects, which can make sport a really toxic environment. And leading up to this application, I counted the numbers of stories on the BBC website that dealt with mental illness and sport, and I hit about 150 from 2017 to 2019. So yeah, that's the interesting thing. That's why I thought it was really interesting with that, the connection there with Aby, because it can be absolutely wonderful or it can be absolutely terrible.
Yeah. I was thinking, yeah, I'm vibing with all of that. I was curiously taking notes, so hopefully the things that I'm thinking on, I can say right now.
We did write a little 2-pager that I can share if anyone's interested on that topic.
That'd be great. Because I guess there's something about this internal impulse. Like, for example, if you do exercise or you play sport for the transcendental quality of play, because play is transformative, right? So if you're engaging in it from a kind of physical need and kind of social engagement where we're playing, and also that's changing through physical action, is kind of changing your kind of neurobiological chemistry, whatever, making you feel good. But exercise gives you endorphins, right? I'm not going to quote Legally Blonde there. Yeah, so there can be that kind of impulse to do that. But if there's these kind of societal structures or societal pressures that become an external dynamic, I guess, yeah, that's when it can go into an unhealthy place, or there can be, I'm just thinking a lot about what you were saying in relation to like power dynamics, and like how within a structure and a kind of culture like sport, it might stem from this natural human impulse of, as I said, play, competition, movement, all that kind of stuff. But actually in a social context, there are extra factors that can make it very not healthy for people and can actually be a very harmful, toxic place. Yeah, so the difference between the kind of internal want and need and natural desire and the kind of external structure and regulation and shape, and also site of kind of power relations and abuse.
Answer that. Got the mic. We have one more question down here. If we can pass it this way. This is the next one. I have clocked you all
Forward.
Forward.
This way. Yeah, down here.
towards me.
Yeah.
For this person, just here.
Thank you. Hello, that was a great discussion. It was great. Thank you very much. I come from an ecology background, so when I hear about microbiota, I think of a community through species interacting. Obviously, a long time ago, before I even started uni, I read an article about this experiment they did with indigenous people somewhere in Africa that did not consume meat, and then they got a group of them and they changed their diet. They could see how the communities of the microbiota were changing. They were essentially evolving because they have very little generation time, so that it was actually evolution. And process, so not even the community itself was changing in terms of the amount of species present and their frequencies, but also what those species were able to do with the research they had access to that was changing. So, but then you were mentioning how stimming can, through movement, through sensory stimuli, you can sort of modulate the way you feel. And then you were also saying that through diet, you can also do that. So now my question is, can you, as an individual, sort of modulate your personality or your main mood or which character you are through diet because of these sort of response in the microbiota community? That was my question.
I can, sorry.
No, I think that's.
Well, I mean, just to kind of start where you started. So it's absolutely true that your bacterial species, the distribution, the community will be very different depending on your diet. Like, and that doesn't have to be specific community. Even if we suddenly decide to go vegetarian for a few months, that will reduce the bacteroides population, that will increase the prevotella, and it really changes the community, which is why in our experiment, we always have to follow up our participants saying that please don't change your diet midway through the experiment, because then all our numbers are off. So, so yes, you can change it, and you're absolutely right that it's a community of bacteria. So depending on what you feed it will be very different, and different bacteria produce different metabolites. These metabolites some travel along the bloodstream and reach the brain, some just influence the vagus nerve and then communicate to the central nervous system. They can have an impact on the nervous system. Now, whether it is as clean as you eat this and you'll be happy, and you eat this, you'll be sad, we haven't found anything like that. But
So exciting.
But for sure, it will have an impact. The other thing, the other word that has not been mentioned in the last hour or so is one of the major products from that microbiota are factors that bring forth an immune response. So they can generate metabolites that can create inflammation, so that can evoke a strong immune response, and maybe Sophia can speak to that. And there are others that would have a reduced immune response. So, and now increasingly within, say, for example, the neuroscience of depression and anxiety, people are investigating the role of inflammation, neuroinflammation, or brain inflammation in these symptoms. So if there are molecules generated by the gut microbiota that can have an impact on the immune response that can then affect the brain, then for sure it can have an impact on symptoms that are affected by neuroinflammation, such as depressive symptoms.
To respond to what you were saying in relation to stimming, and kind of stimming as a vessel for change almost, that makes me think of like the difference between nature and nurture, and how like nature is potentially something that's innate, like who you are within your nature, but also nurture being something that is kind of external causation. And I guess with stimming, and particularly when I'm thinking about stimming as particularly a neuroqueer practice of unmasking, a way to reclaim embodiment outside of neuronormative performance, and kind of embrace that interoceptive inside, but also what the body naturally wants to do. For me, stimming as a physical mode of unmasking could be a vessel to kind of undo some of the nurturing, which is a backward way of saying it. It's not nurturing, it's harmful, but undo some of that kind of social conditioning that can, you know, Nick Walker talks about this idea of character armor, this idea that the body can have chronic retained tension through persistent masking, and it can actually change one's embodiment. That was a tangent. Oh yeah, stimming is a vessel for change. I wouldn't from an impulse say that stimming can kind of take you to, well, stimming is a vessel for growth and change, but it might be more restorative to reclaim and regain one's nature of embodiment outside of the societal performance of neuronormativity. I would be curious though, if there are potentials that could emerge through stimming that take you to a completely new place that could nurture something that maybe isn't just someone's embodied nature, but like another thing. I'm not sure. Yeah. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yep, I see all the questions. Well, I should say we're running out of time. Our speakers will be hanging around for a bit afterwards for the networking. So if we don't reach everyone, please grab me. Yes. 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 I don't know if we have questions online as well. We do.
I was just wondering more about the mental health stuff and exactly like how IBS and anxiety have started to have quite a founded relationship, especially considering IBS was something that was, I think, doctors find hard to treat, like they don't really know how to treat it sometimes, and how that relationship is founded. And I was also just wondering if you knew anything regarding like anorexia and how the gut, just what is going on there, because it's obviously very detrimental on the brain and not then very detrimental on the body. And I was just wondering how the gut is being affected in that stressful relationship, if you know anything about that.
Sure.
I all look to you, Bishop.
I think IBS is actually one of the very few conditions for which there are some really good trials with probiotics that show a very positive response. And so in terms of what we do not know is the exact mechanism through which probiotics would have an impact, have a positive impact on IBS and its associated mental health conditions such as anxiety. I mean, but it has been reported time and again, and there are, I mean, tens of trials on this right now. So so that is definitely one of the success stories of probiotics. But in general, within the field, it has proceeded in parallel with fundamental science. So people are doing clinical trials of probiotics, trying different probiotics and seeing if it improves symptoms without necessarily working out the mechanism of how is it working. If we know the exact mechanism, then we can kind of fine tune the interventions as well. So it's not just intellectual curiosity, but it's also trying to find the kind of more targeted interventions. Now, as far as anorexia is concerned, anorexia is a whole different kettle of fish in many ways. And one of the hypotheses that has been put forward in recent years is that a lot of autistic women would manifest as anorexic or would come up as anorexic because autism was very male biased in its ascertainment. So those women, now we know that there are far more autistic women than we originally thought. And a lot of those women might come up on the anorexia track. So there is a strong overlap biologically, it seems, between anorexia and autism. Now, the question is whether that can be linked to the gut microbiota. I think it's too early to tell. But one of the features that keeps coming up in autism is a very specific sensory sensitivity. So maybe I would not like a specific type of food just because of the texture or the taste or the temperature. And if that restricts my choice of food items that I can have, that automatically restricts my food intake in many. So I think there are quite a lot of parallel kind of symptomatic overlaps between these conditions, but the jury is very much out on how much of it is driven by gut microbiota if at all. So I think we are, I mean, in our studies as well, we would be exploring some of the gut microbiota related variation in relation to autism. But I think there are quite a few groups looking at that. So yeah, watch the space.
Thank you.
One more question here, and then we'll switch online. If you, oh, I'll take it.
Thank you. Actually, quite close on me.
This is good for the online as well.
I know it's absolutely fascinating having those 3 different languages going in, sometimes intersecting and sometimes not. And thank you all for your really, really interesting things that you're saying. Brilliant, really fascinating discussion. Personally, I'm really kind of interested in coming back to the vagus nerve, because that's the thing that I'm really interested in, and also the kind of preponderance of gut problems for autistic people. And I'm really interested in what you were saying about the fact that I think it was 80% of the things are coming to the brain and only 20% coming back. And that, to me, that's the kind of thing that I'm really interested in how the body and mind are communicating through the vagus nerve and how that's working. But I hadn't realised it was quite such a massive difference in terms of that bi-directional, but it's not equally directional. So I was kind of interested in that. I don't really know what I'm asking, but I think for me it kind of sums up the differences somehow. For me, the vagus nerve and that body-mind connection is kind of where these discussions can maybe really come together, and because it kind of meets everybody, what everybody's saying in a way, but also like the different, maybe the languages, which the vagus nerve might have had, like the wandering nerve and the, you know, the traveling womb and all that stuff historically, and just like how all of these kind of questions, I don't know.
Sure. I mean, I think I mean, I was fascinated by that asymmetry when I first read about it.
Yeah.
So I share your fascination for that. But it's worth knowing Vegas is possibly the only direct route that we're talking about. There are indirect routes through which the brain can influence body, and no one really, I mean, so to take it at face value that it's always much more information going in than information coming out across the board, I don't think that would be appropriate. Specifically for the vagus, that asymmetry exists, but it might be that one extra synapse and you have another in to the enteric nervous system, because you have a whole bunch of neurons in the enteric nervous system, so compared to the central nervous system in the brain.
Yeah.
Did anyone else want to speak to any of that before we went to the online questions? Yes, okay. Do you mind if we switch to online? Yeah, you pass the mic. Thank you for waiting, everyone online.
Okay, so just have one of the comments and a question from Stephen online. So the comment is addressed to Aby. So he says, a lot of points about dance clubbing. Very recently, I was dancing with friends in one, and I'm sort of the only one who really goes for it, while most of my other circle are a little awkward, repressed, etc., which I attribute to maybe insecure feelings. So his question is for the whole panel. On the opposite side of movement, what do the panel think the effect is of sitting around all day, like in the typical office environment, implications for stagnation for the body mind?
What are the implications for the body mind of sitting around in a typical office space all day? Who wants to tackle that?
I'm trying to think of things that I can offer that aren't just my feelings on that. Well, I mean, okay, so that makes me want to talk about capitalism, right? It makes me want to talk about aspects of society that we perform and do in terms of social structures that maybe don't speak to our human nature of how we have evolved, right? And capitalism is not natural. Sitting behind a desk from 9 till 5 is not natural. It's not what our bodies were born to do. Which I also think has a big, massive effect on people's mental health as well as embodiment. I mean, mental health, embodiment, I think are the same. But anyway, I'm going off in a tangent. Capitalism, that's what we were talking about as a structure. And that also makes me think about this capitalist value of productivity, of how human worth within that system is understood for what you can produce, and particularly the monetary value that your time and energy and physical application can produce. And within our society, a lot of that is sitting down behind a desk all day, which ignores and does not speak to necessarily the needs and wants of body minds. So, can't really round that up, but for me, it's about capitalism. Maybe someone can speak more on that, but more articulate things that aren't just like feelings and
Sounds like a great
frustrations,
thing
but
to
like,
talk about.
oh, sorry. And also something to add on that is also thinking about how capitalism and the kind of value systems that that creates also in turn can create these categorizations of deficit. There's a great academic called Dr. Devon Price, who's an autistic queer academic. And I haven't read it yet, but there's a book that they have called Laziness Does Not Exist. And it's particularly talking about, I've read the blurb and I thought, that's great, I've got to read it, and I haven't quite yet. But speaking about neurodiversity in a capitalist structure and how that determines how we understand human value, and against the capitalist ideal, neurodivergent bodies are seen, mind bodies, are seen as having less value. And it's very interesting also when we think about stimming, there's a great publication by an artist called Simon Ewell. And within that publication, they talk about stimming bodies being inherently problematic within a capitalist structure, because stimming is a doing of energy that does not necessarily create or produce a product which can then be sold. Absolutely. It's doing for doing it. It's doing it because it is regulating, and it gives value to the nature of the human rather than the structures in which we exist. So yeah, I could also speak about that in relation to choreography, but we're not going to go there today. Anyway, yes, capitalism.
But yeah, that definitely speaks to where it's coming from. Did either of you guys have a thought on this, on the effects of sitting at a desk all day?
Well, I have the boring physiological take. I mean, there have been quite a few trials showing that cardio stimulatory exercises, aerobic exercises, are some of the best antidepressives that you can have. And so and there have been large clinical trials to that, and there are potential mechanisms through which people suggest that there are chemicals, if these chemicals are produced in large amounts and not utilized by the muscles, that can lead to more depressive moods, which if you are exercising more, then you would be using those chemicals. So the chances of developing low mood or for extended periods is low. So this is a very almost banal kind of explanation of why should exercise be a useful thing to do, in addition to the endorphins that Aby has already pointed to, so endorphins and eventually dopamine. Yeah, I mean, there is no kind of duality of views in the fact that sitting behind the desk from 9 to 5 is not a good thing. This is one of the few things everybody has consensus on.
All I would say is that, say during the late 19th century up until the 1950s, the type of children that were of most interest to psychiatrists were shy, withdrawn, quiet children that were introspective. After Sputnik in 1957 and the increased focus on science and engineering careers for everybody, the focus switched onto hyperactive, inattentive kids who like to move around. So There you go.
There you go.
That's brilliant. Love the
Yeah.
cohesion of this answer. Guys, we've run over. I'm really sorry. I know there are other questions in the room. I'm very sorry. You have already run over, but hopefully we still do have time to have a drink and a chat, and people will be hanging around. So do approach and do ask them. And thank you for thinking of so many questions. I'm just going to hand over now to Sophia to round us off.
Yeah, so before we break off, there's a few people I would like to thank. Before I do that, a reminder to the questionnaires, they should all be on your chairs, so please hold them out. So first and foremost, a huge thank you to our speakers, Bhismadev and Aby. It's been wonderful to have you tonight. We've talked about so many interesting things. I feel like I've learned plenty, and I've been thinking about things I've never even thought of before. So thank you so much for really good for your time and your knowledge. A big thank you goes to our sponsors. Thanks to them that we're able to have such a wide panel, and that comes from different geographical locations. So a big thank you goes to the College of Medical Veterinary and Life Sciences for sponsoring us with the public engagement research fund award. In particular, thank you to Alison Calderford and Suzanne Bendu, and also a big thank you to the Glasgow Medical Network that awarded us the early careers award fund. In particular, Gavin Miller and Kristen South. Of course, a big thank you goes to the Advanced Research Center Public Engagement Team for allowing us to visit the events in their Brooklyn, in particular, Cassie Dillon. A big thank you to everyone else in the biodefense team, Michael Gilwater, Theodrita, Rachel Lewis, and Aby Watson. Thanks to all the contributions and hard work that I will have in this event. And of course, thank you to all of you for joining us tonight, both in person and online. I hope many of you can stick around. It's not every day that there's people with so many different interests in the same room, so I hope to chat to many of you. So please join me in thanking everyone, in particular our speakers, and see you next time.